Welcome back to the shop, guys. In this video I will be discussing two strokes versus four strokes, not only from a rider perspective but also a mechanic's perspective. Because just 10 years ago you would have thought the two-stroke was dead. I mean, there was just none on the track on the local level, 125s or 250s. Yeah, we always had the 85 cc's because that's what they are, it's two strokes, but as far as the big bikes, it was pretty much non-existent. But there's been a huge spike in popularity in these things recently, so I thought it's kind of important to discuss them a little bit. Especially, I see a lot of people that have been riding four strokes and never even ridden a two-stroke, and now they're all of a sudden interested in trying out a two-stroke. So we're going to talk about all the different aspects of the difference between a two-stroke and a four-stroke, and maybe even some conspiratorial stuff of why they tried pushing us all on the four-stroke. So let's get into it. That's me back in the day. We were all on two strokes. That's me on my RM125. I think that was 2003. Then I got a 2006 YZ250. That's that bike right there. Great bike for the time. Then I got a KX250 2006 and had that with my YZ250. I would kind of ride one weekend, the other one the other weekend. Another great, fabulous bike. But my second CRF450 was this one right there. You see me back there behind that chick. That's a 2009. That was the first year of the fuel injection. That was a great bike. I really enjoyed that bike. It was good. It was fuel injection. It wasn't electric start, but it was fuel injection, and it was light for a 450. Rode my brother's YZ450 one day and ended up getting my own. There's mine right there. And rode that for quite a few years, and then went back to the YZ252 stroke. There it is right there. It's current picture. Oh, just draining the gas out of my bike before I wash her up. But anyway, there's been a huge spike in popularity on the two strokes lately. Back in 2010, 2011, 2012, I would show up to any local track here in Florida, and I might be the only guy on the track that was on a smoker. Seriously. And yeah, there was always 85 zipping around. You could hear them on the track. But as far as the big bikes, a lot of times I was the only guy. And if you did see someone show up on a smoker, it was usually that guy that hasn't ridden in quite a few years and pulled his old bike out of his shed and barely got it running. It's all clapped out and it's just, you know, bouncing around the track. But for the most part, there was no one actually competitive on the track on a two-stroke in that time. It really did seem as if two strokes were just gone, just dead. You know, they were just a thing of the past, and four strokes for the future, and that's all there is to it. But around 2019, I went and picked up this YZ250 two-stroke you see right here, and I made a video, which will be linked in the description below. I did a little review on it, and in that video, I prophesized. I said, two strokes are the future. They're going to make a comeback. I said that at the end of the video, and I actually meant it. I kind of knew they were going to make a comeback, and well, that's what we're seeing now. So why is that? What happened? There used to be a saying back in the days that what wins on Sunday sells on Monday, and there's some truth to that. When you have guys winning on a particular brand bike, you'll notice that you're going to see a uptick of popularity in the sales on that bike, and the manufacturers know this. Back in, you know, the two strokes kind of faded away from the pro racing circuit at the year 2006. In the year 2005, Ricky Carmichael actually had the option to run the RMZ 450 or the RMZ 250 two-stroke, and he chose to run the 450 outdoors and the 250 two-stroke indoors, as well as like Chad Reed and stuff. You would see them on the two-strokes on the Supercross track. So they had their option in 2005. However, in 2005, the AMA put in a no lead rule, meaning you can no longer run lead in your gasoline. Now that doesn't really hurt the four strokes. They don't need lead to be tuned to maximum performance, but two strokes actually need lead to be tuned to the highest levels. And here's where the conspiratorial side comes in. I believe they did that on purpose, knowing that if they could handicap the two strokes and keep them down, they could push the four strokes in. So, you know, VP quickly made a lead-free two-cycle fuel that was designed to work around the no lead rule. But Ricky Carmichael at the time even said that it just wasn't the same. It just didn't have the same power and the same pep. And I'm quite sure AMA and the manufacturers work together, because if you really think about it, and they're both in the business together, and if the business and the sport does good, they both do good. So to think that they don't work together would be naive. So these pros like Ricky Carmichael and Chad Reed, they tried their best in 2005 to race these two strokes with the no lead, but yeah, by 2006 we were all wondering at the beginning of the Supercross season, what bike are they going to pull out? Are they going to pull out the 2-stroke again, or are they all going to go to the 4-stroke? Well, would you believe it? Every single rider, pro rider out there lined up at the gate in 2006 on a 4-stroke. Every single one. No one picked the 2-stroke. Kind of suspicious, but that's how it went. But what's in it for the manufacturers to push us all on 4-strokes? Well, I once heard from a Japanese manufacturer representative that that the 2-strokes motocross bikes, they weren't really making profit when they build them and sell them. That's not where their profit was at. You got to remember, this was at a time when you could pick one up for $6,000, and that wasn't where the profit was at. They calculated their profit in the life of the bike, how many parts they're going to sell for that bike throughout the life of it. So they're more in the business of getting the bike in your hands and then making money on selling you the parts for it throughout the life of the bike. That bike can be around for 20 years, be ridden for 20 years and sell parts for 20 years, and that's where they planned to make their money back then. However, you know, around 2005, around the mid 2000s, a lot of aftermarket companies started coming in and selling parts like hot rod cranks. Now you didn't have to go get an OEM crank. You can buy a hot rod crank. Athena cylinders and cylinder heads. If you busted your cylinder head up or your cylinder, you didn't have to go buy an OEM one anymore. You could buy an aftermarket one. You had all balls making swing arm bearing kits and just pretty much you really didn't have to, unless you busted your transmission up or you broke a case. You can get pretty much everything aftermarket. Your plastic, you name it. So, you know, they had to figure out a way to start making money on the bike sales themselves and also make it harder for aftermarket companies to make all the parts for it. So that's where the 4-stroke comes in. With the 4-stroke, they could, you know, at first they had to sell it about the same price as a 250 2-stroke or 125 2-stroke. But most of the people in the sport knew that the prices of bikes are about to spike up pretty quickly, and they have, and they did. But not only that, by them producing 4-stroke motors that take a lot more parts, it was going to make it more difficult for the aftermarket companies to keep up with all these parts and all these changes. You know, now you have valves and timing chains, and not to mention when you blow your motor, which we'll get to this a little bit more later in the video when I discuss the maintenance and catastrophic failures and such. But when you blow your motor on a 2-stroke, let's say your rod bearing completely goes out, for the most part you might need, worst case scenario, a new crank, new piston, new cylinder, and new cylinder head. On a 2-stroke, they typically don't take out the cases, and the cylinder heads are pretty basic, and it's just a slab of aluminum pretty much. A 4-stroke's a little bit different. When your rod bearing goes out, it can actually break the rod and completely trash your engine cases, which will take out your cylinder head, your valves, can even take out the camshafts with it, because it's now, you know, the valves are getting smashed into the piston and cause the camshaft the gear on the camshaft to shift. It can take out a lot, and it can get expensive quick, and you'll be buying a lot of OEM parts. So long story short, I think they kind of figured out that with 4-strokes, it'll keep you coming back to the OEM to buy your parts more often than not compared to the 2-strokes. So in that area, it's kind of a win for the manufacturers. And also, not to mention, the Japanese manufacturers are not stupid. Now, I mentioned Japanese and not the KTM, the Austria company, because in the mid-2000s, the Austrian company didn't really have a whole lot of power in the motocross community and world at that time. But the Japanese manufacturers knew that the average motocrosser was getting older in age. You know, there was a huge boom in motocross in the mid-80s, the early 80s and mid-80s, and these guys were getting older. They're becoming vet riders, and I think Japan saw the 4-strokes as a way to kind of keep the dads and the granddads out there riding longer. More kids were getting into video games instead of getting outdoors, so they knew that the majority of the money that they were making was also going to come from the vet riders, not just the youth anymore. So they kind of pushed the 4-strokes. They were pushing the 4-strokes. They knew it was going to kind of help extend the age of the average rider, and I believe it has for the most part, because if you look on the track, when I started riding tracks pretty consistently in the year 2003, the vet class was a very thin class, just a few older guys in it. But now on any given day at any track, you look, your vet class is just as big as your A and B class or your C class or your beginner class. And you see a lot of gray hair men walking around, guys 50, 60, heck, there's guys out there 70 years old going around the track these days. And you know, I do believe a lot of that is because of the four strokes. The four strokes can give a sense of stability, and it's easier to find your power with the torque and stuff like that. But we're going to get to that a little bit later in the video when I discuss the differences between the two. So in 2006, you pretty much had every pro rider out there on a 450 or 250F. No one was racing the two strokes anymore, not even Bubba Stewart. And Motocross Action around that year started to talk bad about the two strokes. I know nowadays they say they've always loved them, but you know, if you go back in the magazines, you'll see they pretty much made it sound like these were weak bikes, slow bikes, and if you want to be a fast rider, this is not what you're going to want to be on. And they were nut hugging the four strokes throughout the years. I know, again, recently they were like, we've always loved the two stroke, but yeah, I remember the past. I remember that they just dogged them, and MXA back then had a strong hold on the motocross community, a lot more than they do today. And what they published, a lot of people just kind of believed. So around that year, I saw a lot of people ditching their two strokes and picking up four strokes. Around 2006, when all the pros went to them, you saw all the local riders just kind of parking. The ones that were still on two strokes were kind of parking them and picking up, showing up at the track with brand new shiny four strokes. But in 2006 and the mid 2000s, with the four strokes, they were kind of crude machines in my opinion. They were still carbureted. They now had two throttle cables, had a very heavy throttle pull, very long throttle pull too at that. And the clutch pull was heavy. They were hard to start, especially when they were hot. It was not uncommon to see someone drop their bike on the track, pick it up, and be sitting there kicking it for 15 minutes till they finally get it to start. They had a hot start little trigger on the handlebars to try to lean it out, to help that out, but they were pretty crude machines and heavy, but they were selling. People were buying them. So around that time, I went and bought me a CRF 450, 06, and I still had a 06 YZ252 stroke. I rode that bike for about 4 months, and I just couldn't get over the heavy throttle, being a little bit difficult to start, and boggy. If you jump in the throttle too quick, they had an accelerator pump on it that would crudely shoot a big shot of fuel right into the motor when you wick the throttle open to try to cure the bog. But even then, they can be a little bit boggy and just very crude feeling. Rode it for 4 months, parked it, sold it, went back to the YZ252 stroke. Told myself I would not try a 450 or a four stroke again until they went fuel injection, because I did see what fuel injections did to the street bikes, and it definitely cleans them up, makes them sharper. They don't bog. That's what the four strokes need. They really do need fuel injection to really run good. So I told myself I wouldn't ride one again until then, which, as you saw in the beginning of the video, I showed you my CRF 450 from 2009, and that was a pretty good bike. So, but yeah. So let's talk about the maintenance a little bit. Well, again, I work on them for a living, so I'm very familiar with the two strokes and the four strokes and kind of what it takes just to keep them alive from week to week basis and long term. These modern day four strokes are really good, and really, for the most part, you don't have to work on them except for general maintenance for at least the first 100 hours. You can even run a piston 100 hours on a 450. I even see people doing on 250Fs, although I don't suggest running them that long. But you can just run them for the first 100 hours typically with no issues, unless if you are going to have issues, probably going to happen early on in its life, like the Honda seem to have starting issues, the Kawasaki with their fuel pump recall. You know, it's going to be early in the life if you have issues, but otherwise you can kind of just run them for 100 hours and just putting pump gas in them and changing the oil and cleaning the air filter and changing sprockets and tires. Two strokes are a little bit more week to week maintenance. You have pistons that don't last quite as long, so you're gonna have to do top ends a little more often. You got to mix oil with the gas, the pre-mix, and you have reed pedals that might fray after so many hours. You might have to replace them, but everything's cheap on a two-stroke, so it's more of like a nickel and dime. It just kind of nickel and dimes you through time, and a little more in the shop, little quick just quick maintenance things. Like this YZ125 right here, I could do a top end on it in 1 hour. I'm not even kidding. Actually, I could probably do it less than that if I pushed it, but typically it just takes me 1 hour to get that jug off, swap a piston, and be back up and going. Where a 4-stroke, I'm pretty good at doing them, but typically they take about 4 hours. I've heard of people that don't work on bikes for a living or are not very mechanically inclined. It can take them 2 days to do a top end, but me, about 4 hours. But you know, the 2-strokes can nickel and dime you. You got to buy pre-mix oil to mix with the gas, and that's, you know, it's not expensive, but it's not necessarily cheap, and it can add up through time. And then, you know, again, you have to do the pistons. Like on a YZ125, you're going to want to do it at least every 20 hours if you're a decent rider. Maybe a slow rider can push it up to about 40. On a YZ250 2-stroke, you're going to want to do it about every 50 hours at top end, where a 450, you can run it about 100 hours before a top end's really due. And then you might want to do a time and chain with it. And that's all fine and dandy as long as it's just maintenance. Where things start to separate themselves pretty extremely is catastrophic failures, if that motor lets go. On a 2-stroke, the parts are just cheaper and you have less of them. You don't have valves, you don't have a timing chain. The cylinder head, there's not really much in it, so if you damage the cylinder head, I mean, they're pretty cheap. You can get them for $100, $150, maybe $200. You know, they're pretty cheap. If you price a 4-stroke cylinder head, they can be bare bones, no valves or anything in it. They can be as cheap as $600, expensive as $1,200. And then you're gonna have to do the valves. Each valve can be about $75 each. And it just, to put a whole cylinder head together can be real expensive on a 4-stroke. So if the motor lets go and it damages the head or the cases, which they can do, it can get expensive real quick. It's not uncommon to dump on a full motor catastrophic failure. It's not uncommon to have to dump $2,000 or $3,000 in parts on a 4-stroke to get it back up and going again. It does happen. Where a 2-stroke, you know, your maximum, maybe if your crank went out and it took out the cylinder and cylinder head together, crank, cylinder head, everything, $1,000, $1,200 in parts. Worst case scenario, $1,200, I would say, you know, versus $2,000 to $3,000 for a 4-stroke. So where the 2-stroke will nickel and dime you week after week, a 4-stroke is more about the big costs later on if it catastrophic fails. So if you're the type of guy that doesn't typically keep a little bit of money in the bank and you kind of live paycheck to paycheck, a 2-stroke's probably going to be better for you on that, because it just nickel and dimes you. And if you do have a 4-stroke and you want to ride every week, you might want to always be sitting on a few $1,000s ready just in case. And then of course nowadays with fuel injection, electric start, and everything like that on these 4-strokes, you can have electrical issues pop up that you don't see in the 2-strokes. And what I mean by 2-strokes is your carburetor ones. I'm not so much referring to the new KTM and Husky that have the fuel injection with the fuel pump, and you know that started in 2023. I'm leaving that out of the equation here. Mainly, I'm talking about your carburetor 2-strokes. There's not a whole lot electrical on them. You generally never really have an electrical problem, and if you do, it's going to be a stator that went out, but it's pretty rare. It does happen, but it's pretty rare. On the 4-stroke, so I've seen fuel pumps act up. I've seen voltage regulators act up. The whole starting system, from a starter clutch to starter relay, starter button, battery going dead. It's not uncommon to show up to the track. You go to hit your start button and nothing happens, you know. And then because it is an electrical problem, oftentimes it can be a little bit difficult to diagnose, especially for the inexperienced mechanic. I have even had bikes delivered to me right from a dealership where dealerships couldn't figure them out and gave up on it, and people brought it to me seeing if I can figure it out. Luckily, for the most part, I've been able to figure them out. Pat myself on the back for that one. But yeah, that's something you got to consider on these newer 4-strokes is you have more electrical stuff that can cause a ghost to pop up in the machine, where on these, heck, I've even seen the CDIs on them go out and had to replace them, you know. Maybe I've seen one CDI on a 2-stroke go out ever, but I've seen probably about 4 or 5 on the 4-strokes go out. So, you know, the CDI is more complicated when you have a fuel injection and mapping and all that in it. It's doing timing and feel. It's running on a 12-volt system with the battery. It does start becoming like a car, so to say, as far as that. It's not only just a CDI anymore. It is now an ECU. But other than that, your week-to-week maintenance, you know, just general things, oil changes, air filter, adjusting your chain, It is about the same, except for, I would say, the 450s. The 450s do have a tendency to just eat right through their chain. They have so much torque, and it comes in a chuggy fashion, like that it just kind of just pounds on the chain, and it eats through rear tires. So that's really the only difference from week to week maintenance. The 250Fs aren't so bad at that, but the 450s, even over the 252 stroke, the 450s definitely eat through chains, sprockets, and rear tires. Other than that, the week to week maintenance is about the same for the most part. Now, we already discussed parts, but now let's talk about labor. Clearly, a two stroke is going to be less labor than a four stroke. If you're doing your own labor, well, then it's just time. It's going to take more time on a four stroke than it is on a two stroke. But if you're paying someone, well, obviously it's going to be a bigger labor bill and can be significantly higher too. Usually about twice as much labor on a four stroke, the labor bill, versus a two stroke. Top end, bottom end, um, diagnosing electrical issues, whatever the case. But if you buy a brand new four stroke and it doesn't give you any new bike problems, well, like a lot of people out there, you should get 100 hours of maintenance, just maintenance only. And, that's nice for the first 100 hours. Here's where things really get sketchy, a little bit iffy for me, is when you run a bike past 200 hours. On a two-stroke, you generally just replace the parts as they wear. When you run your cylinder until it's worn to the point it needs to be replaced. You run your crank until the rod has enough left and right play that it starts producing up and down play, and well, then it's out of there. Four strokes are a little bit different. On the four-stroke motor, when you reach the 200-hour mark, you have to replace the crank. You should replace the crank no matter how healthy it still checks out. If that crank has 200 hours on it, you need to replace it, because at some point the rod can actually just break just from hours and hours of running, expansion, and being stretched and being yanked on, and they just break. Same with your valves. After 200 hours, you need to replace the valves no matter how good they check out. I've seen valves just drop the head right off the valve and just tears up the motor. So, and then you got valve guides, valve seals, you name it. At 200 hours on a four stroke, you have to go through the whole motor and replace a lot of stuff to get it back up to a good safe standard, so that it doesn't grenade on the face of a jump and send you over. You don't want that. So, if you're buying a new bike and you're buying four strokes and you got the money, run it for 100 hours, sell it, or run it up to 200 and sell it. Because at 200 hours, you're going to be taking an old bike that has 200 hours in it and dumping a ton of money to make it safe and reliable to be raced again. And so that's kind of where they separate themselves financially pretty significantly from the two strokes. Where a two stroke, like this one right here, 100, I don't know if you can see it in there, 153 hours on it, still original crank. All I've done on this one is pistons and suspension maintenance and just your general maintenance stuff. Still got the original crank in it. Now my wife rides it. She rides it easy. But, if it was a four-stroke, I would, even though she rides easy, I would have to do the crank and the valves at 200 hours just for safety reasons. But because this is a two-stroke, I can continue to run it with the same crank. There's no valves to worry about. Yeah, I changed the reed pedals, but they're cheap. So that's where they kind of separate themselves financially, is definitely at the 200-hour mark. So if you plan on financing a bike or buying a four-stroke and you're like, I'm just going to keep it for a lot of years, that'll justify me paying this $10,000 or $12,000 for this nice new shiny bike. Keep in mind, if you plan on putting a lot of hours on it, you're going to run it past 200 hours, you have a big bill coming at 200 hours if you want to keep the bike safe and reliable. So if you remember earlier in the video, I mentioned how I believe that they came out with the four strokes. Japan actually pushed the four strokes on us also to try to extend the age of the average rider, to make sure that these vet guys that have the money to dump a lot into the sport were able to ride to a ripe old age. And for the most part, it's true. I see a lot of the older guys at the track on 450s, and they can just use the torque of the bike. They don't have to worry about always being in the right gear or being real quick on their clutch to keep it up in the power band to get over the big jumps. The bike just kind of and gets them over them. And that's really all they're looking to do. They're not looking to lay the bike flat in the corner so much these days. Maybe kick a little bit of roost in the corner, but nothing too crazy. But they definitely want to get over the jumps, and that's what the bike kind of allows them to do. And because the bike is a little bit heavier and a little bit, they kind of have a natural stability feel to them. Also, because when you chop the throttle, you have engine braking, you don't have to be quite as good on your brakes and or have quite as good throttle control on your right hand to control the speed and the pitch of the bike. You know, it's everything's done a little bit slower on a four stroke, and as you roll out of the throttle, like in the air, you can let go of the throttle and it'll just kind of start dropping the front end for you, or you can give it gas and it'll pick it up. Where the two strokes are very free rolling. A lot of times, if you take a four stroke rider, stick them on two stroke, they'll be like, man, I was blown away with how fast that bike shot me into the corner. I'm so used to just chopping the throttle and the bike slowing down on its own. I was like, oh man, now I got to get on these brakes hard. I'm going fast into this corner. But that's how they are. And you'll notice that when people first start riding two strokes that are used to four strokes, they'll jump front end high a lot. And the reason being is because they're rolling out of they expected to be able to jump the bike, pulling up on the front end because they're a little bit creeped out by the jump, and then chop the throttle in the air and the bike just slowly level itself back down for them. But on the two stroke, it doesn't do that. Whatever pitch you send it in the air is kind of what it holds, unless you put a little bit of body language into it or you know how to control the bike in the air. You know, like a good 125 rider will know how to do a brake tap to get that front end down. You know, you don't have to know how to do that to ride a two stroke. You can just set yourself up right in the face of the jump with good body position and know how to control the bike in the air with body movements and body positions. And you're going to want to have them skills under your belt if you're going to ride a two stroke to its full potential. Where a four stroke, kind of, you can get a little lazy and you just use the throttle to kind of help control the pitch in the air. It has the torque to get you over the jumps. It's a little bit of a heavier bike, so it typically has a more stable feeling to it. And that sounds all good, but there are some negatives to that. And I would say the biggest con to that is if the bike does get out of control. Let's use a 450 worst case scenario. On a 450, when the bike swaps out on you or just gets out of line, it's a heavy bike and it's kind of a bossy bike. It's not as easy to get it back in check and get it back underneath you. Two strokes are going to be easier on that. I would say a two stroke is easier to get it out of line, but also easier to get it back in line. A four stroke is harder to get it out of line and harder to get it back in line. So consider that. To be a good two-stroke rider, you're definitely going to want to master your brakes because the bike's not going to slow itself down on its own like a four-stroke. You're going to want to be able to master your brakes, your clutch, and throttle control. And then also proper input, sending the proper input to the bike so the bike does what you want it to do. These are the things that two strokes love, and if you ride a two stroke, you will become better and better at these things quicker than you would if you're only riding a four stroke, which in the long run can make you a better rider. These young guys, they seem to learn that really good, really quick, and that's why two strokes are typically good for young guys, and they were for years. But for the older guys, they get a little stubborn. They just want to go out there and jump a few jumps and feel good and crack open a beer and go home. But if you are an older guy and you do want to actually become a better rider, get on a two-stroke for a little while. It will definitely sharpen your skills. I can honestly say that. I'm 46 years old, been riding most of my life, and that's just my honest opinion. You will get better with your brakes because you're going to have to use them. You'll get better with your clutch because, you know, there's going to be times you go out of a corner too low RPMs, and you're going to have to learn how to feather that clutch or pop it and get it going. And then body positioning. You will learn real quick, since the bike is more sensitive to rider input, you will learn real quick that if you send it the wrong input, it does the wrong thing. But if you send it the right input, it does the right thing. And you'll learn real quick what is wrong input, what is right input for each and every situation and scenario. Then later on, if you get back on a 450 or 250F, you will find you're a better rider because now you've been fine-tuned by a two-stroke that the four-stroke, even though it's a little more stubborn, you're going to be more likely to send it the proper inputs at the proper time and get the bike to do what you need it to do. And as for overall power, we'll compare the 250 two-stroke to a 450 and the 125 to a 250F. In overall acceleration, the 250 two-stroke is very similar to a 450 for the most part. Yeah, it is a little more critical to be in the proper gear, but otherwise the overall power, I usually find that if there's a jump that is out of a corner and you got to use all your power until you're in the air, typically a 250 two-stroke will throw me as far as a 450 will to get me over that jump, no problem. People often mention that they seem to get more traction out of the four strokes. In my opinion, it is easier to control the traction because the throttle is it's kind of a little more connected to the rear wheel. But as far as overall traction, to get the speed, to get over that jump, I find them to be about the same for the most part. If you're laying down all the power, they're both going to accelerate you at about the same rate. Now, of course, on the dyno, 450 will make more horsepower than a 252 stroke. But again, you're talking about a bike that's typically about 20 pounds lighter. And that kind of means a lot. They're a little bit lighter on their toes and just allows them to kind of zip through the dirt without digging in as deep and being bogged down by digging in the dirt as deep. And they just accelerate pretty well. Do a couple mods to the bike, which is cheap, by the way. And do a couple mods to the bike, and you can pretty much get all the horsepower you ever wanted or needed. The mods in these, if you wanted to mod them, are a lot cheaper than a four-stroke. You can get a pipe and a silencer on this for under 500 or less. You get a nice pipe and silencer of any brand. To get a nice pipe and silencer on a header and a silencer on a 450 or 250F, you're going over $1,000 for a decent one. 1,200, 1,300. It goes up quick. And any modifications on a four-stroke are going to be more expensive than they are on a two-stroke. On the 125 compared to a 250F, that's where things separate themselves a little bit more. 125s are really all top-end machines. They don't quite have the torque of a 252 stroke. They're mainly just top-end. Where a 250F does have a little bit of torque, the 125 really doesn't. And even though they're very light on their toes, if the track's a harder packed track or it's not that deep, they will scoot along just as fast as a 250F. However, when things get deep and it gets heavy, a 250F will kind of walk away from a 125 in stock form. And even with the extensive mods on a 125 in heavy conditions, the 250F is just kind of going to be a little bit easier to get it going. So that's where they kind of separate themselves a little bit. However, I will say the advantage would be on the 125 in muddy conditions. Even though it's thick and heavy, the 125s are so light that when things get sticky like that, like sticky, nasty mud, the 125s do scoot to it really easily. And they're not as heavy, so they're less likely to slide out on you. So now let's talk about the chassis a little bit. I'm going to kind of leave KTM out of this part. They have the steel frame, and steel frame, it's constantly changing as it ages. They start out kind of rigid, and they break in really quick, and then they're consistently changing as they get older and older. So I'm going to kind of leave that one out of the equation here and just talk about the aluminum frames on the Japanese bikes when we're talking about the chassis. So the aluminum frame, mainly just your YZs. It's a dated frame. There's just no getting around that. And I feel that. If I ride my 125 next to a YZ 250F, I'm going to feel that the 250F has a updated chassis. The aluminum frame, like a 2021 YZ 250F or newer, I can feel that. It has a more composed frame. There's just no getting around that. And it even shows more on the 252 stroke, where I can actually feel some funny flexing in certain areas, up at the front end and down at the pegs. There's just a little bit of pinching going on here and there. It's just an outdated chassis. Now, it doesn't seem to affect my overall speed when I compare myself, like let's say on a 125 versus a 250F or a 252 stroke versus a 450. My overall speed is generally the same, because even though the chassis is not as good, the bike is lighter. So it's more of just things that I'm feeling, and not so much things that are affecting my performance. But it is there, and these newer bikes do have a better chassis, and if you're a decent rider, you're gonna feel that. And you would think, well, why not just take a 252 stroke motor and put it in a YZ 250F frame? Well, as you know, you see these pro racers changing out engine mounts and stuff like that to get a different characteristic out of their chassis. So it's not only about just the frame, but it's also going to be how the motor's mounted up to the frame, what kind of mounts you use. So it's going to be a hit and miss of how that chassis is going to turn out if you're trying to put a two-stroke engine into a four-stroke modern chassis. It's going to be kind of hit and miss. You might get lucky, you might not. Now, as far as safety is concerned, in my opinion, a two-stroke is a safer bike to ride on a week-to-week basis than a four-stroke. For obvious mechanical reasons, I would say these modern-day four-strokes have fuel pumps. A fuel pump can go out at any time with no warning, and the bike just goes boom. Also, if you run the tank too low and you run out of gas, there is no warning. A couple weeks ago, I was at Lazy Spring, and I watched a guy on a YZ450 punch the bike going towards a jump, leaning forward, anticipating the acceleration, and the bike just goes, boom. It just died, ran out of gas. And because he was throwing his weight forward, anticipating a huge amount of acceleration, it threw him over the bike, over the top of the jump, and he just Supermaned right over the top of the jump, landed on the downside. Luckily, he didn't get hurt. But yeah, if you run out of gas on a modern day four-stroke with the fuel pumps on them and fuel injectors, they just shut off. They give you no warning. And if the fuel pump goes out, it just shuts off. No warning at all. That doesn't happen so much on your carbureted two-strokes. If you run, there's no fuel pump first off, so you don't have to worry about that. And if you run out of gas, there's a float bowl in the carburetor here where it holds fuel, and it will slowly just lower the float bowl until the bike shuts off. But as it's lowering the level of the fuel in the float bowl, the bike's going to run leaner and leaner. It's going to start bogging. It's going to give you an indication that you're running out of gas. And as long as you pay attention to that, you probably have, if you shut off your gas on a two-stroke, you probably can get 2 laps out of the bike before it actually shuts off. In them 2 laps, you should notice that it's starting to bog and starting to run lean. And hopefully you pull off and check your fuel and find out you're running out of gas or you're out of gas, and it can save you from getting spit over the bike. And then catastrophic failures. On a four-stroke, when the motor gives up, they typically lock up. They lock up the rear. It's a and the back wheel locks up. That's just how they are. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but it seems to happen a lot of times when people are giving it the biggest handful of gas right before a jump. I don't understand why, but that seems to be where it's most common to happen. And it just locks the rear wheel up, and yeah, it's not pretty. It's not safe. For whatever reason, when a two-stroke is catastrophically failing, it actually kind of lets you know. Yeah, it might only let you know 3 seconds or 5 seconds before it's actually done, but you feel it coming. Or sometimes they'll start like and getting heavy on you, and as soon as you let go of the throttle, finally it just dies, and that's it. It's done. But they don't typically lock the back wheel up when they fail. It does happen, especially if you break a piston and it gets caught up in the crank. It can lock up the back wheel. But even then, when you're breaking a piston, you hear it happening. You got a good 3 to 5 seconds to decide if you still want to hold it pinned for that jump or not. And but in most cases, it doesn't lock up the back wheel, at least. So if it does die on you, at least you have a free rolling back wheel. Now, if you're not looking to, race these bikes or run hard on a motocross track, you're just looking to play ride, open riding areas, whatever, ride into the woods, just play ride. And I'm going to say two-strokes generally better for that, and I have a few reasons why. First off, they don't run as hot. It's hard to overheat a two-stroke. You can literally leave it on the stand and just let it run, and it probably will not even overheat. Where a 450 or 250F, leave it on the stand and it will overheat within about 3 to 5 minutes of idling. It's just how they are. They don't have cooling fans on them. Either of them do. But four-strokes make more engine heat, and so they need that air going through the radiator the whole time. When you're play riding, sometimes you're just cruising along at low speeds. That hot four-stroke can get too hot. Or a two-stroke, you can just putt along. You can ride with your kid if he's on a little 50 or 65 and he does 3 miles per hour everywhere. You can follow him on a 250 stroke all day long, and it's not going to overheat. So for play riding, I would say the two-strokes are definitely better. Plus, they're funner. Open fields, doing wheelies, the rapid response that they have, the way they sound, you can't beat the sound of a two-stroke. When it comes to play riding, I think a two-stroke, hands down for me, is the winner over a four-stroke. If you're buying a two-stroke after watching this video, you're riding four-strokes, do yourself a favor and grab yourself some spark plugs. Two-strokes, typically they can... Whoa! This guy's trying to attack me. We got killer roosters in here. Anyway, two strokes can typically, I mean, it can happen. They can foul a plug, especially if you're new to riding and you're riding them slow. I never foul plugs these days anymore myself. I keep them wide open. But if you're a slow rider, it can happen. So if you're going out, you're buying yourself a two-stroke after watching this video or whatever, pick yourself up some spare plugs. My suggestion is if the bike ever doesn't start or doesn't want to run right, just change your plug out first. That's step one before you take it to a mechanic to look at. And of course, you're going to want to pick yourself up tons of two-cycle oil. I have a link in the description down below on two-cycle oils, what ratio you run, things like that. I have a few links down there you can check out related to this video. Well, that's pretty much it. I know someone's going to ask me about e-bikes and where do they fit in. I don't think e-bikes are going to replace gas bikes anytime soon. I know in the car world, you know, it's been everyone's fear. Let me get rid of this rooster real quick. This sport's a hobby. I know they call it a sport, but it's more of a hobby than it is a sport, in my opinion. And in hobbies, we get to choose what we want for the most part. So the government's not going to step in and say everyone needs to be on an e-bike by 2029 or whatever. It's just not going to happen. What we buy is what sells. And as you see, people are starting to buy two-strokes again. A lot more than they are e-bikes, that's for sure. I don't think e-bikes are going to threaten the internal combustion engine on our motocross bikes anytime soon. Yeah, we might see them on the track. We might see them kind of start to blend in a little bit with us, but I don't see them replace them. Not in our lifetime, at least. So I don't have any fears of electric bikes. That's pretty much all I got for you guys on this one. Hope you enjoyed. Hope it was somewhat informative. I hope you guys had a good weekend of riding. It's Sunday. We rode Moto Bros yesterday. As you can see during this video, I was cleaning my bike. It rained midday, and boy, they got muddy. Look at all that mud and stuff on the floor there. But they're all cleaned up and ready to go. But yeah, I hope you guys had a good weekend of riding. If you enjoyed this kind of stuff, please click subscribe. I will have a ton of links down in the description here, including one how I wash my bike. I don't use pressure washers. I'll explain that in that video if you're interested. And yeah, catch you guys next time.